Welcome, everyone. This is week 2 of MFP 545. Um, last week, we were talking a bit about utility theory, and I use that as the starting point, as the basis for most economic thought. And in fact, that was the basis for most thinking that was being done. So whenever you learn about economics, you will learn about Adam Smith's theories. Now, Adam Smith would write on Homo economicus when he would write, which is basically the rational man. However, at the same time or even prior to Adam Smith, David Hume, also a philosopher and an economist in Scotland, had made the observation that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. In other words, we are not necessarily, just rational people. Rather, we are human beings. And in fact, Adam Smith, in a subsequent book on the moral sentiment, said that man seeks to be both loved and to be lovely. In other words, deserving of love. What Smith is doing is he is shifting a bit over to Hume's statement that, we are driven and motivated by our emotions and our appeal to one another as human beings, so that we have to understand how to relate to people in that way. So that's kind of this shifting, even there, from utility theory, which was kind of a cold analytical view of what early Adam Smith would say with respect to understanding economics, to adding in this view of prospect theory, which brings us into our reactions to both gains and to losses, quite human reactions as we find. And then how the effects of framing can come in, whether you bring it in as a positive frame, saying that 600 people will live, or a negative frame, which is 400 people will die in our example. So that's kind of what we talked about last week. And so tonight we're going to add some context or explore the roots of some of these issues on losses, the things that make us into the people that we are. Okay, so let me move over to here, and there we go. There's Mr. Mouse. All right, so the discussion board, I forgot to update that. I did update the discussion board comments on my notes for tonight, of course. So there were some interesting comments from people. One is that, a summary of the discussion board on, again, prospect and framing is that it appears to me to be that there are more and more firms that are working to improve their risk questionnaires in such a way that doesn't trigger biases. In other words, the old 5 or 6 question risk tolerance that you had to do to check the box was easily biased answers. How do I feel today? I'm not even answering the right question on these things. Whereas with multiple questions that are reframed, you're going to get a much more honest response. So how many of you have gone through that process within your firm of completely updating the risk tolerance questionnaires to be more of a psychometric process? Does anybody know what psychometric means? Has anybody ever looked at Phenometrica, the risk tolerance questionnaire that is used in, that's the risk questionnaire that is used in Money Guide Pro, and a few others have used it. And it's really this questionnaire that is 50, 60 questions. And it follows the logic, the same sort of a pattern as I put in my posting of the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. And what they find is in psych studies that if you ask a question 4 or 5 different ways, the whole issue of framing, you're going to get a far more honest answer as you start to back out the biases or the frame, how people hear things. So you're going to, at the end of the day, you're going to find far more honest answers. It's sort of like that issue of when you start to engage the client and talk about real dollars and cents versus percentage. You get far better responses, or you're going to get more honest responses out of dollars. That's what this whole idea is. So I'll go back to my question. How many of you have gone through the process at your firm of changing your risk tolerance questionnaire? Have any of you done that? Okay, interesting. Sound like, okay. Eric?
Mr. Edwards?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Eric. I was just going to jump in on that. We did tweak our questionnaire a little bit. Moving forward, we're actually trying to split up the questionnaire from just a few basic questions to actually 2 meetings where we actually do a life discovery to find out more about their background, and then ideally coming back and doing a second meeting to learn about their financial side.
Good.
So it makes it, lengthens the process, but makes it more robust as far as what you're learning.
All right, and I'm gonna talk to that in just a second. Then Lucas then brought up the problem of risk-averse behavior in retirement portfolios. So here comes the question that always comes up. When you are talking to clients about retirement, and the need to put away funds for retirement. And frankly, that's the primary reason why people engage a financial planner, is to say, I need to get my ducks in order for something that's going to happen down the road. So when you are talking risk and return about asset classes to a client, because at the end of the day, investing is the tool that they use, are you using annualized data, or do you use data that has a time frame that matches the retirement frame for when they're going to retire? What kind of data do you provide for them? Come on, you guys, you have to provide them with inputs.
So I'll throw, there's Eric again, I'll throw mine in there. We normally will do a back test, and then based off our forward-looking assumptions, we will give them a number. I don't know about other firms. Ours is usually much less moving forward. I think it's one of the old adages, we want to, would rather under-promise and over-deliver. But yeah, we do show forward-looking assumptions based on returns, and then based off our forward-looking.
Okay, but are those returns predicated on annualized returns?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Brian, what were you going to say?
I didn't have anything to say specifically, but I'm thinking if in terms of coming up with a risk profile for clients, I think our portfolio managers typically do kind of a conversational interview, and they ask questions around their experience with investments and what they've done in the past. And it's not a form or a survey we hand out to our clients. It's more of like a multi-day interview process as we build the portfolio and move things in and out of the portfolio until they're 100% comfortable with what we've got. All kind of in the backdrop of achieving the ultimate goal, which is making the money last as long as it needs to.
All right. I'm going to go back And both of these are more consistent with moving towards that Grable article that I sent out today. But I'm going to go back to my other question, and that becomes something to think about. When you're discussing with clients and trying to give them a perspective of risk, when we think about risk, part of the problem is that we present risk of the market in terms of annualized risk. But I don't know if Lucas remembers this, but in 591, one of the things that I would explain and discuss with people is if you hold equities for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then take a look at the returns, of that portfolio, what you're finding is that the standard deviation shrinks dramatically. And so if I've got a client who is 65 and the client is asking about longevity insurance annuity, my answer is always going to be, you are much better off, even though you face a little bit of the RMD issue, you're much better off to buy a portfolio with the assumption that, no matter what I've looked at, the annualized return on the market is going to be somewhere between 10 to 12% over time. Okay, and the standard deviation, if you hold a portfolio for 20 years, that standard deviation is going to be down to the 4 to 5%, which means that you're going to end up with annualized returns somewhere between 7 and 15, 18%. Okay, if you put away your money today, okay, at 65, and you're not even thinking about pulling it out till 85. So it becomes a much different proposition. This is a thing that Michael Kitces has been writing about over the last couple years, and even Wade Pfau had shifted over to that, is you got to think about time horizon when you're talking about risk to people, to try to pull them away from that short-sightedness that they have. A third issue is that people hate unknowns and the inability to control. This is why clients are comfortable putting too much into their own company stock and non-diversifying. Who was talking about that in their discussion board? Somebody was.
That was me.
Okay. And I think that becomes one of those issues that everybody faces, is because the client feels like they can control their own company. We're going to talk about this again. Or, they understand their employer. What is the danger of that, Erica?
Well, first of all, you're not only super concentrated in one thing, but also if you work there and your savings are there, then you're doubly concentrated in that one thing.
Yeah.
The survival of that one entity.
Yeah, you're solely dependent on it. So, we used to battle to make sure that the rules limited the amount of company stock you could ever hold in a qualified plan. That's very frightening. And then the last thing that I think multiple people talked about was how you communicate with your clients. And that's why I sent out that chapter of Grable's book. Like I said, you'll be reading more on this when you take the capstone course. But the gist of what Grable is talking about is learning to see your client as a whole person, so that, the first mandate is know your client, no matter what you do in the financial industry. Okay. So that means you have to learn to know them financially, emotionally, psychologically, and try to determine what their prior assumptions, their priors are, just as you need to know your own, which is why I like the idea, we talk about EGADIM. This is the data gathering part of EGADIM. If you do it over 2 or even 3 meetings, and you build on it with You can use, a lot of people I know use a mind map like I am showing right now on the screen to build on this sort of thing. I think that's a great way of doing that. But I urge you to take a look when you can at the Grable article. I think it'll get you a little bit excited, but I think it's important to understand this. Okay. So, as I said before, the first half of the course, we're going to be talking about the what's, what happens to people. Tonight we'll talk about emotions and heuristics. I'll describe them, and then we'll move on to different biases. Week 4, we'll talk more about the biases, and then we'll talk about some of the broader things that people do. And like I said, in the second half of the course, then we're going to start talking about the implications of what happens with people. This is just back to the basic stuff. It's part of that introduction to finance, where we have the focus is on utility, where we have expected outcomes times a given probability. But that's the problem, is these are givens, okay? So we're stating the outcome and the probability as if it's already known. And as we talked about last week, we suck at understanding really the probability, how to determine probabilities of things. So if I think it's always important to always keep remembering this. Oh, God bless, I was able to talk to Cindy about my problem last week. So when we're thinking about probabilities, we think about things, okay, it moves in a nice line like this, but really here's what our probabilities look like, is we go like this, and then we assign a lot, too much chance of something happening, and then everything in the middle is the same, and then we kind of go like this up to 100% here. Okay, so everything at 80% to 100%, well, we want to believe that the odds are that it's going to happen. Okay, even if it's an 80% probability. And if something is very minimal probability, we're going to give it a much higher probability because we're always optimistic. Okay, that becomes kind of the problem of when we become subject to prospect theory. Is I think it's, again, it's a good thing to understand, but there are drawbacks. Again, what is the difference between utility and prospect theory? Can anybody remind the class of the difference from last week? Don't be bashful. Utility theory is the way people should think to an economist. What's prospect theory?
The way people actually behave.
That's right. It's a description of the way people actually do things. Okay? And so that's the one that we really need to focus on, is that element. So why can't we be fully rational? Why aren't we? Well, I studied Herb Simon when I was in college back in the 70s. And Herb Simon was an economist. He became a Nobel laureate in 78, but he did his research in the 50s and 60s. Okay? And the way he described people, let me clear my drawing, is that we have bounded rationality. So his contention is that we make rational decisions, but we are limited by our knowledge, by our information, by time constraints, and by our biases or our cognitive limitations is what we'll be talking about on this. Okay? So, it's this boundedness that becomes part of the real problem. We were talking, again, Brian made a comment that people will barter and they will negotiate and do everything when it comes to buying cars, but they have no idea, they don't want to talk about any of this stuff when it comes to investing. Well, I made the comment that my partner, who was a founder of Wilshire Company and had started, helped start this whole thing at Wells, which became Barclays, the research that comes out of there, so the guy really, knew investing inside and out. But when it came to cars, he was terrified. So when he decided, and he would do this every other year, he always decided he was going to buy a car and this was going to be the car. But he was just so paralyzed, and he was worried that if he delayed, he wasn't going to buy the car, and then he would have to think about it, and he wanted to avoid the regret. Okay? So he knew that he was acting irrationally. But he justified his own irrationality by his behavior and just going in basically and purchasing his car for retail, whatever they asked for him. To him, it was a rational decision to avoid the pain of the negotiation. And I think there are other people who would just as soon do that. So what we would say this was irrational, to him becomes very, very rational. So I think that just adds to Simon's thoughts that we make rational decisions for our own personal reasons or with our own limitations. To an outsider, they're irrational, however. Which, kind of makes me think back to the efficient market hypothesis. So again, we assume full knowledge and instantaneous knowledge, that we all know everything at the same time, that we interpret that information in a logical manner. There's no friction. There's no transactions costs. There's no taxes. We can do things. We have all the money in the world that we need, and that we can arbitrage. Those are all worthy assumptions. Not a single one of them is a legitimate assumption, but it is the way we think about it. So when Simon would talk about market efficiency, he would say, well, markets are relatively efficient. Okay, so we have each of these limits, and there are participants who can engage in each one of these limitations, a fairly large number of people. We have hedge funds who can short and arbitrage. We have ARB funds left and right. We have people who really understand the idea of transactions costs. We have qualified institutional investors who don't deal with taxes. We have people, this is their whole life, is to see how quickly they can get knowledge, the news of change and what's going on. And we have analysts and managers who are interpreting the news. So we have all of these people that within the boundaries of their expertise, and with the assumption of consensus of expectations for earnings and what's going to happen in a company, we have everybody has their own piece of the puzzle. So if you take a look at that puzzle and you were to think of it of everybody, you might say, well, if I take a look at everybody's assumption of what's going to happen, it would look like this, very broad, diffuse. But the marketplace is a single pricing mechanism. So what this does is it takes all of these inputs and assumptions, all of this knowledge, and it squeezes it into one central pricing mechanism called the market. Okay? So that's why the efficient market hypothesis works to a degree, is because it has a central point for price discovery to occur. And so this price right here has to reflect the consensus of all of these opinions, all of this knowledge on the outside. So the only news that can really change things is new news, okay, on an individual company basis. The only thing that can change things is all of a sudden a new assumption on risk. So everything always has to be kind of new in Simon's world, because we're rational with what we've done otherwise. Richard Thaler, another Nobel laureate in just the last year, has added to this, okay, with a couple more items. One is, he made the statement, we don't know what we don't know. Or as the old song goes, you know, thems that knows they know, thems that don't know they don't know, okay? And then he added to that something else that we'll talk about later. That's what you see is all there is. Or in Kahneman's book, he shortens it to Wysiety. Okay, so it is sort of, again, that our bounded knowledge, that, you know, we can see what's in front of us. We know what we know. And we always make this assumption because we don't like ambiguity. We don't like not knowing. So we make the assumption that what we know is representative of everything. Okay? So again, we are rational from the standpoint of our knowledge set. Thaler also added to that the whole idea of limited willpower. He calls that hyperbolic discounting, which means that what we're going to always do is value the near term far more than the long term. You know, the old bird in the hand is worth two in the bush sort of way of thinking, which is going to affect retirement saving. But we'll talk about that down the road. Remember to please jump in if you have a question or a comment, okay? Now, this is always fun for me, you know, because it's fairly heady stuff. So this is from a conference a few years ago that we went to, the Lilly conference. And we were talking about brain and learning. So Terry Doyle was talking about brain research. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the brain and why we act like we act. You know, Doyle contends, and I agree, most things I've ever read, you know, is consistent with this, that what we are today is a function of evolution, okay? So our brains have evolved to solve problems, but these are external problems. They're basic survival problems. So we eat or we are eaten, okay? And so constantly what we have to do is to identify what is food to escape danger. Otherwise, we become food, okay? So we're always working in this direction of survival mode. If you think about that, life as we were developing, as our brains were developing, was a constant threat, okay? So we evolved to pick up on these threats. And we constantly still do that. Do you know what the greatest invention, probably the biggest, the most important thing that happened to humans in their evolution? Cooking. Has anybody ever heard that?
Yes.
Okay, and why was cooking? Why did that advance everything, Erica?
Sorry, I don't remember. Something about improvement of health and...
actually what it did is it allowed people to get their calories and enough calories to allow for brain growth in a much shorter time frame. So if you look at cows, or if you look at any ruminants, they're chewing all damn day. They're digesting. If you look at a big cat, in the wild, when that cat in the wild has killed something, he's eaten and he doesn't want to even think about food. I remember I was in South Africa and I went right behind a lion who had eaten just the day before. The lion couldn't have cared less because the lion was busy digesting. If I'd threatened the lion, then I would have been toast. But other than that, it didn't bother the lion that, there was potential food right there around because he wasn't hungry. Okay? So that was the problem. Why people, why we didn't evolve until we learned to cook. And once you learn to cook, then you have time to do better things and your brain grows much faster. Okay? So this is part of the idea that we would learn to then survive predators and survive starvation. That's what cooking did for us. And the third thing was to survive as a clan. We needed to have a group because within, if you look at kangaroos or cows or anything, the prey animals always survive best in a group. Predators will hunt in a small pack, but the prey, they do better in a larger group. Has anyone ever heard of the Dunbar number? Oh, all these fun concepts. Okay. The Dunbar number is a number of the number of people who you can trust, your closest confederates or within a group that you can trust. And the reason that it's important is that you need to be able to identify quickly whether somebody is a friend or a foe. Are you a threat to me? Do I have to kill you? Or are you going to help me? Okay. And the number that this man Dunbar came up with is that you can't really work with groups any greater than 150 people. And even that is stretching. So when you read about somebody who's got 8,923 followers of their closest and dearest friends on Facebook, you can read into that what you want to read, but it's likely to be bogus. So this week, I've also asked you to watch a video by Jonathan Haidt. Has anybody looked at it yet?
I watched part of it. I didn't make it all the way through yet.
All right. Is he an enjoyable speaker?
Yeah.
Oh, he's wonderful. I read a lot of his work. What Jonathan Haidt has done is he has moved from this realm of, thinking as the traditional liberal, and he says, no, it isn't about, liberal. It's really about this whole idea of tribes. We learn our beliefs and our perceptions, our culture comes from our tribe, how we were raised, where we were raised. So he's written a book called The Righteous Mind, which talks about morality in politics and in culture. And it's a fascinating book. So if you ever get a chance to read it, I will type it here. And then I'll get right back to this, but I think The Righteous Mind by Haidt. So what he talks about is that we learn to communicate in the language of the tribe. Okay? So if you think about that, what are the implications for communicating with our clients? If we have evolved to learn to communicate in the language of our tribe, and you just saw that last night, if you wasted your time watching the conversation, there you saw somebody who's communicating to his tribe, to a small base of people, and he spoke in their language, not in a broader language. So what does that mean for you guys as people who deal with clients?
I would think maybe not using really large vocabulary, talking the way that they can understand.
Yeah, you want to make it simple and easy for people to understand what you're saying. What else, Brian?
I take it as only pursuing clients that would fit my tribe. Makes it a lot easier on me. But I do have a bias towards, like, no matter how much money somebody has, if I feel like there's not a connection between us, or we're not speaking the same, we're not in the same universe, then I will kind of outright decline to work with them.
Yeah, and that's important because you need to understand and appreciate their language, and they need to understand and appreciate where you're coming from. It's got to be symbiotic. Exactly. And I think that becomes really important to understand. And that is very consistent with this whole idea of our evolution, our evolving, is we're still very tribal in a lot of our reactions. So, we've evolved over time, and we've developed this cerebral brain. Okay, our brains were built to survive. I'll talk about S1 and S2, but we have this whole process then of associatively coherent thinking that we've created, which is really, it's rational thinking within the context of our environment. Okay, so if our brains have evolved to respond to sights and sound and facial expression, this is why we have to worry about the number of people that we trust. Okay, is that a frown or a snarl? So all of this cues us to physical response. Okay, it's a pre-emotion. Okay, it's something that's deeper, more visceral than actual emotion. We are always ready to act. The problem of that is that we're kind of in this model that we can only work with our environment as far as it takes us. So we'll talk next week about Maslow's hierarchy. But when you see a homeless person and you're saying, well, you read sometimes people will be writing about them. Well, why can't they get a job? Why can't they do this or that? Well, here's the problem. When you are hungry, you only have one thing on your mind, okay? And that is to eat. And until you can get that food in you, until you're comfortable that you're going to be able to eat, can you move on to doing something else? When you are jobless, you're worried about your job, unless, of course, you're my brother-in-law. When you're an addict and you are hopelessly hooked on your drug of choice, that takes over these things. And again, they are deep within you, okay? And they keep you from this rational thinking. So we'll talk more on that, like I said, next week. So these are all stimulus, things that are constantly happening from the outside, okay? And we're constantly vigilant. We're pumping cortisol into our brains. We're getting ready for fight or flight because it's external, okay? And we can't control what that lion's going to do, but I sure as hell can control what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be running real fast, faster than my wife, so that I can get away from that lion. And I told her that out in Africa. But markets don't allow for that. And that's the problem. We can't control markets. We can't necessarily even, as December proved to us, we can't even necessarily understand the stock market over time. People will tell you after the fact that they understand it, but at the time, they tend not to be able to. So markets don't allow for those necessarily easy binary choices of fight or flight, because you're sitting there and all of a sudden you're waiting for Fed actions, and then you're looking for earnings reports, and while you're waiting for an earning report or something from the Fed to happen, well, now something has happened to impact our estimates for a client or for a company. And then, now there's a tariff that's being put on, and now there's a meeting in the White House, and there's somebody with a gun in an airport and a tweet. Okay? So you've got this media cacophony, this noise that just adds to this idea that nobody understands the market, nobody can control the market. So how many of you were a bit stressed last month? I like that. Hungry and angry.
Yeah, I'll throw it out there. I'll definitely say that it was definitely a busier end of the year than normal. That's for sure.
Yeah, a very interesting end of the year. It's a nice Midwestern way of sometimes saying it. But yeah, that becomes the whole issue. And now you understand why your clients get themselves very upset, why it triggers that fight or flight sort of mechanism in them, because if we don't really understand these things and can break it down easily, imagine how they must feel over the same sort of situation. So the brain has evolved to act. So let's look at the brain for a few minutes, okay? I'm going to get my little pencil again. So when we were first coming up out of the ooze, one of the first things we have is down here, a little tiny area that's just on top of what we have as a spinal cord. And, I'm assuming we're mostly mammalian, okay? So on top of that spine where our nerves are is called the medulla, okay? And this medulla, or our rudimentary mammalian brain, allows us to breathe, to digest food, to poop. We can, we're just there doing things like cellular systems do. We're not thinking. Then we developed what's called the pons medulla, okay, which expanded on this a little bit more. The pons medulla is where the idea that we have eyes and ears. Now, there is no one point in the brain that says, this is your eye, this is your ear. There are multiple points in there that kind of work together to give us sight and the ability to hear. But as this evolved, then we could respond. Again, it's outside stimulation, but we could react to it. So people always like to work in, when you took biology or when you studied genes, you always did poor Drusilla, just Malagasar, the fruit fly. Everything was with fruit flies. Well, fruit flies can react to stimulus, and fruit flies can learn to avoid danger. They don't have much of a brain, okay? But they have enough that they can respond to outside stimuli, okay? Then we developed the cerebellum, which I brought up a few minutes ago. Again, with this cerebellum, we now have movement. Boom, boom, boom. We have, limbs, and we can start to get around. So now we're breathing, we have a temperature, we can avoid danger, we can survive, we've got territory, we've got our reproductive drive. Okay, we can balance, we can move, we can run after things, but we're still not really, we don't have conscious thought. We don't know yet where conscious thought comes in. Okay, there is no one place in the brain that's the source of thought. At this point, we've kind of gone backwards. We finally then developed the limbic system. Okay, so people, you've all heard about the amygdala. Okay, and we always say that the amygdala is the center of our emotions and our instincts, for fear and anger, fight or flight. Really what the amygdala does, it's not the center of it, but it's kind of the gatekeeper, okay, for all these other emotions, because critters that don't have an amygdala, or even people whose amygdalas have been damaged, still have responses. But it's the amygdala which is really that central controller. It also leads us then to our long-term associative memories as we develop those things. So, still, in our caveman brain, we look and say, oh, canyon, bush, lion probably behind bush. Okay, so you develop this whole idea still within the mammalian brain, but a little bit more, that you have to start looking for things. Okay, and that's those first rudiments. Well, here's the problem. This is our trigger for, anger, attack, fear, and hatred and jealousy, all of these issues. So who does the media talk to? Who was the whole discussion last night talking to? Was it talking to the mammalian brain, or was it talking to our logic and analysis? Okay. Was it really talking about rational thought? Was it talking about morality? Who was the conversation really being engaged to?
The mammalian fear-based brain.
Exactly. And that's what you have to remember with your clients. Okay. When we are comfortable, when your clients are comfortable talking about an area, talking about something that is not a threat to them, then they're willing to engage in discussion that can go up to the level of the neocortex. That's the problem of economists and Democrats, is both groups will talk to the neocortex and they'll try to rationalize things. They'll try to logic things out all day long, where, when you're talking to people who are afraid of basic needs, basic issues going on, they're thinking with their mammalian brain. They're not able to move it out to that neocortex. So, the economist is always saying, don't worry, be happy, man. So while your buddy's being eaten by a lion because he guessed wrong, which part of the brain should you really be talking to? Which part is listening? I don't think it's that neocortex at all. So I think that becomes part of that issue of what goes on. What's interesting is Haidt wrote another book called, I can't think of the name of it, but again, it was on the elephant and the rider. And he talks about the issue that our behavior is like an elephant. So what happens when in the old stereotype, what happens when an elephant runs into a mouse?
Theoretically, it's afraid.
That's right. He goes, I'm startled. And the elephant is going to start running. Okay. So you've got this poor mahout sitting on top of the elephant trying to drive the elephant. Do you think the mahout has any control on the elephant when the elephant's running? The mahout has no control. That elephant is scared to death. And that elephant is just going to run until the elephant doesn't anymore, you know? And you can talk all day long. You can talk to the mahout about what he should do. But that elephant is 40 times bigger or 80 times bigger, depending on the size of the driver. So the driver, there's nothing that the driver can do. Well, that's the problem. When we're engaging our mammalian brain, when we are talking in a state of fear, when we're not in a position of comfort, when your clients are not in a position of comfort, they are the elephant, and you need to talk to the elephant. Okay.
There is, that's actually on YouTube. You can look up his video about the elephant and the rider.
Okay.
It's really good. It's short too. And it's, the thing I took the most away from that though was, saying that you're exactly what you said, that you can't ignore the elephant. Everyone is trying to talk to the rider, and you can't ignore the elephant.
Exactly. Because it's the elephant is the one who's going to steer everything.
Right. It's actually making all of the choices.
Yeah. And the only thing you can ever do is to talk to the elephant long before to convince the elephant that the mouse isn't a threat.
Right.
Because when it's happening, it's too late. So because of that, what we've done is we've developed heuristics. Heuristic comes from the Greek word eureka, which means I've got it. Okay. So a heuristic is nothing more than a shortcut in our response to actions. And they work. Okay, it's a rule of thumb. And we've evolved these heuristics. You know, people, we evolve them as a society. We evolve them individually based on our own prior experiences or what we've been told. I'm working with my dog on steadying him for bird hunting. I train dogs. And, you know, I'm teaching him to respond to a whistle. Whenever he hears the whistle, he's got to sit. No matter what he's doing, he can be chasing a bird at full speed, and if I blow that whistle, he's got to sit. And it's got to be just sort of, oh, automatic. I just do it. I never think. You know, it's pre-thought is how fast a heuristic is. Okay? And it's really a good thing for us because it allows us to deal with the familiar issues every day. Okay? The problem is when we engage our heuristics when we're faced with unfamiliar or uncertain situations. And that's really the focus of this course, is making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, you know, for us and for our clients. So what we end up doing is we revert to these heuristics. We use anchoring, representativeness, availability, things that are going to help us avoid ambiguity or just not being in control of a situation, the ability to understand a situation. We are going to apply these heuristics whenever we run into a problem. Now, it might not be the right application, and that's what gets us into trouble, but it makes us comfortable. So I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to give you a question, okay? So look at what I've written down. You've got, you know, your relationship with a partner has hit a rocky point, and your partner's birthday is coming up in a week. Now, he or she has mentioned that there's something that they found that they'd love to have, and yeah, there you found it. But the price is more than 2 times higher than it will be at some point down the road if you waited. The money is kind of tight. What do you do? Okay. How many would buy it, still buy it right away? Raise your hand. Nobody? Would everybody wait? Oh, okay. I'm not seeing hands raised. Okay. So Corey has raised his hand. Okay. So Corey, were you going to respond to this? How would you react to this?
but the pain of the purchase is a one-time deal, but the ongoing disappointment from your partner is limitless.
Okay, and I think that becomes, it's that gut reaction that you've rationalized it now after the fact, but it's there. You're going to make the purchase. You've justified it, just like my partner would do with his cars. Eric, you would wait and explain the situation. Are you married?
How could you tell? Yes, sir.
Obviously you've been married for a while, because if you were in a relationship pre-marriage, you might not have that opportunity.
Right. No, I took the question very literal in my personal situation, because I thought it was an interesting question. I would buy it. I would give a card saying I'm going to buy this, but I'm going to wait for it's on sale, just because I know that she would appreciate that as well. So I know it's kind of a loaded question for me, but that's how I answer.
Well, and I think that there's lots that goes into this. You might have a spouse who has a little bit deeper than my daughter, as Brian points out, and God bless. But, there are a lot of people that just like those bright, shiny objects when they can get them. Okay. And so I think that Eric is right. It depends on, do you want to keep that relationship going or not, regardless of the logic, the economics of that issue. And I think that becomes, again, part of this whole issue. Okay? So, your emotions now have entered into that decision, of whether to wait or not, and what are going to be the implications. So, what that means is that we've really replaced, if I go back to, once again, I'll come up here in our corner. If I come back up here in good old Foursquare, then up here in the realm of gains, where we are happy, okay, then, we're going to put things in one sort of context, okay? And our outcomes here are going to be bad outcomes. So we're replacing finance, we're replacing wealth with outcomes. And our outcomes now are feelings and emotions. So where you might be happy doing something, you have to think about how unhappy your partner's going to be of not getting something. Okay. And that's going to lead to this next level of discussion that we're going to have for a few minutes. So let's talk about emotions. So what are some of the bases of emotions? Well, we have a couple different types of emotions. And in your textbook, they do a pretty good job of doing this. So the first type of emotion is the expected emotion. How am I going to feel if something happens? How am I going to feel if I get an A in this course? Okay, so now you're anticipating the future. How am I going to feel? Well, if I'm going to get an A in the course, I'm going to feel pretty good. But that's down the road. Then you have the more immediate emotion, okay? And that immediate emotion is, first, there's integral, okay? That is, how do I feel about this feeling? Well, Professor Edwards seems like kind of a nice guy. He likes to throw some salty language in, and he likes to laugh a lot. I feel pretty good about these lectures that he gives, and I really like this class. So I feel good about the idea that I like the class. So it's sort of I'm thinking about the outcome. I'm going to learn a lot, and it's something I really want to know. But I'm feeling good about it right now, even before I get my outcomes. And the other kind of emotion can become the incidental, which has nothing to do whatsoever with the event. Okay, so again, because of my dogs and my dog training, one of the things I like to do is to keep the dogs from stealing from each other's bowl. They have a bowl that is their bowl. And when I see a dog sneaking in to steal another dog's bowl, I will go hide behind a table or something, and I'm going to drop a pan. Clatter, 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 and the dog will go, whoa, what the hell was that? The dog looks around and doesn't see anything out of place, and the dog goes back to stealing from another dog, and I'm going to do it again. Whoa! And I like to do that to mess with their heads so that they start thinking about, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. It's that whole idea that nothing happened to them that hurt them, but they start relating. It's an unrelated external event, but the feeling was of being startled and afraid by this. So maybe I should not engage in that event. It's kind of that whole idea of avoidance. Okay, so let's put this into a little bit of context. Let's assume that you worked hard last year, and though you're not supposed to ever talk about raises, let's assume that you've heard from other people that they got a 15% raise this year. Okay, so now you're thinking about got this raise coming up, and it's going to be 15%, okay? Or this is going to be your bonus. And you're thinking about, how am I going to spend it? And now you're smiling, okay? So you're thinking about the expected emotion. How am I going to feel when I get this thing, okay, this raise or bonus? And now you're thinking about, okay, I think I'm going to buy a car. I'm going to buy a nice car, because I've been driving this POS for years now. I'm going to get a really nice car. And as you're thinking about it, now the integral emotions come in. You can smell it in your mind. You can feel it. You can feel how you're going to feel driving this car, okay? And the road trips that you're going to be able to take. So you get these two different emotions, and then you only get an 8% 8% increase. Okay, how are you going to feel if you get an 8% increase in this situation?
Super disappointed.
You are. But didn't you get an 8% raise? That's pretty damn good, isn't it?
If I didn't know that something else was a potential.
Aha. So the key to that was you were already planning on what you were going to do with the 15% raise. It was already there. You heard about it and you thought about it, and it meant something to you. Okay? And now, you went from Christmas Vacation to Christmas Vacation, the movie, real quickly, when this all happens. Okay? So now, think about it from your client's perspective. Okay? You go into a meeting with your client, and the client, the market is down 10%, and the client's portfolio is down 2%, and the client is really unhappy. Does the client have grounds to be unhappy? Lucas.
Yeah, I think they still have grounds to be unhappy because they lost money, but they shouldn't be as unhappy as everybody else is.
Are you going to tell that to the client?
I'm going to word it in a different way and help them try to understand that even though you did take some losses, we're not as bad off as maybe if we didn't have a plan in place or we didn't do something there, and help them try to understand that, and that they can still feel a little bit okay with not feeling great about losing money, but still helping them understand that they didn't lose as much as everybody else is losing.
That's right. I like Brian's statement. You took less of a beating. Okay. You're welcome. Who's been in this situation before in a meeting where you've had to have a meeting with a client where the portfolio is down, but it wasn't down as badly as it could have been? Who's been in a meeting like that?
I just had one a couple days ago.
And
I mean, it's. I mean, and what?
how was the client? Was the client happy?
I think it's initially he was. I think it's the way we framed it when we talked about where we were. We basically won the business in July and took some risk off the table. So his exposure to equities was down significantly. So we framed it in the context of what his previous portfolio would have looked like, and then walked through where we were at. But at the end of the day, we're still down and still cognizant of it, not just telling them to not be disappointed, but understanding like this is where we're at and this is our plan moving forward.
Okay. Brian.
Yeah, we whenever we do our investment reviews, at the bottom we break out total portfolio, we break out equities and fixed income, and then we show each of the performance of each compared to their relative benchmarks. And obviously recently it's been pretty tough, and we're just now getting our audited our audited statements from the end of December. But even before that, if we showed less of a loss than the benchmark, we basically we said it in a positive way, like, oh, we did a really good job controlling loss in the portfolio because of the way we had it positioned, and we said it kind of in a really happy, positive way. And we do the same thing on the fixed income side if we show less of a loss, which was, which is kind of the point, and that's something we talk about when we're building the portfolio in the first place. Is we may be taking some off the top in terms of earning potential, but we're going to control the downside as well.
Do you understand, however, just on this discussion we had about that 15% versus the 8% raise, where your clients are coming from?
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to say is I feel like you have to acknowledge on some level, what their expectations may have been, and the fact that they're probably disappointed, whether you think they should be as disappointed as they are. I feel like you sound like a person who isn't listening and isn't empathetic if you don't at least acknowledge the fact that I understand that you're probably disappointed at how this statement looks at this point in time.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to, again, and I keep coming back to that theme, you have to understand where they're coming from. So let's talk about where they're coming from, that emotion. And Ackert and Deves, again, do a pretty good job of talking about how an emotion is created, because emotions will drive our reactions, the heuristics.
Something I just want to add in real quick.
Okay.
Off Erica's point. I feel like it really depends though on the strategy and the mandate for that particular client, because we have a lot of clients that are 100% passive, and our views, we're not going to apologize for market performance when we're taking a passive view and it's part of an overall asset allocation. And I think when we're taking a view with active management or private equity or a hedge fund strategy, that area, I think, you own it completely because we're the advisor, we're the one pulling the trigger. But when we start looking at just the overall performance of, call it the S&P and U.S. equities, like I feel like it changes the dynamic a little bit if I'm apologizing for the broader market's performance, not your particular investment's performance.
Okay. You can still see that sometimes, though, the client, because you guys are the experts, whether you can control it or not, whether it's passive or active, they're still going to hold you somewhat accountable for the results. I hear what you're saying, Corey, but I think that the reality is people are going to be, by nature, they want to hold somebody accountable. for the damage. And their damages, they're going to put things into perspective of where was I back at the end of September? Remember, prospect theory, the end of September, my portfolio value now becomes my reference point.
And just to be clear, I completely agree. We're accountable for everything the portfolio does and fails to do. It's just more from the standpoint of the portfolio performed exactly how it was supposed to. If you're passively tracking the S&P 500 and you're down the same as that, and I think explaining that early on in a relationship, I understand what you're saying, but I still disagree to a certain extent.
Yeah. And you can, because, this is the value you're trying to add. But, my point is that clients are going to have an emotion, and you have to honor that as well. And so I think that becomes, that education that you have to give them up front, because we've got these emotions. Let me keep moving on a little bit. Let's assume that you're driving in that car that you bit the bullet and you bought it with the 8% raise. Okay. So you still bought this car. Everything is satisfied. You're going down the PCH. It's a sunny day. You got the top down. You see beautiful people on the beach. The birds are singing. The hills are once again green. We've had some rain. Everything is really happening. You're just cruising along, and then, whoa, some son of a bitch just cut me off. It's the first thing that's going to happen is he cut me off. Okay. So it's a personal thing. Okay. And, you assume then it was intentional. Even if it was grandpa who doesn't have a clue what he's doing, you're assuming that it was an intentional action. So when that happens, you now become physically aroused. Okay. You grab on, your blood pressure is up, your heart rate starts to rise, and then you're going to express your feeling by flipping the guy off, and then you're grabbing the steering wheel again. Okay. So you're going through these states that are quickly moving from one to the next. And then you've got this broad range. We call that the balance of positive and negative sort of attitudes. And the positive, all of a sudden you start to think, oh, thank God I didn't hit, the guy in the rear end. I didn't damage this brand new car. I don't have to worry about, the insurance issues. Oh, geez, it could have been a whole lot worse. And then you come right back again to being angry. You want to act, honey, go in the glove compartment and get my pistol. Because after all, we're on the PCH and it's California. Okay. So you run into these responses. You've gone from fear to relief, then to anger. Okay. But our emotions are not the same for everybody. Okay. They go from innate to learned, and they are partially culture. So if you are from New York or from LA, you got stupid drivers. When you're up in the Midwest, it's sort of, okay, something like this happens. You go through the same sort of basic emotional view, but then instead of that desire to act, then the desire may well be to pull into a bar somewhere, have a beer, maybe eat a turkey gizzard, and come back out and drive, because after all, you were enjoying your day looking at tractors and combines. Eric, did you have a question?
I did earlier, but I'll be honest, I don't remember what it was.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. We'll just jump right in when you do. Okay.
Thank you.
So this is the idea of how emotions develop. Now, this is a chart from Jacques Panksepp, who passed away a couple of years ago. And he says that we have all creatures, and they do a lot of work with dogs, and cats don't have the same emotions. Cats just have anger, and otherwise they're hedonists. But they do work with dogs and horses and other animals, obviously primates. And they find these same basic 7 emotions, that people are seeking: anger, fear, pleasure, and lust. Sounds like 18-year-olds. Care, grief or panic, and joy. And then you can go to the next level, the secondary level of seeking, which is really the element of, we love surprises. We like to forage and look for things. We're inquisitive. You know, sometimes I get so involved looking for doing my research, and I'm just enjoying the hell out of the process of doing the research and learning new stuff. Okay. And I'm happy doing that. And then you can go to tertiary emotions, but they all have different levels that you can go through as you do this. And they're shared. These are emotions that are shared across all cultures, regardless of where you live, in different manners. There's one other that I think that Pangsap kind of dances around, but I think is important. That is, well, he does have disgust, does he? Yeah, he shows it in anger. Some people put this whole thing of disgust or morality into the same context. So that's what hate will talk about, because different cultures will deal with morality with different values of some of the same things that happen, but they will still react with the same emotion. It just evolves differently. So blood in one culture, it's not a problem. Death in a certain culture might not be a problem. Within our culture, we hate death. We fear blood. Depends on where you are. And it all goes back to the way we have evolved. Now, here's the issue, is that emotions are critical for our decision making. Does anyone know the story of Phineas Gage?
The guy who was impaled.
Yeah, what happened?
I don't remember.
Brian, do you remember? I thought you had your hand up.
Are you referring to the story that they had in the textbook where he got impaled in the front of his brain?
Yeah. So he was a construction foreman, and this was in the 1840s, and they were working on in a gravel pit, and there was an explosion, and a rod came up, and it went through his cheekbone and out his brain. In essence, he was the first really recorded case of a frontal lobotomy. It went through in such a way that it didn't kill him. And in fact, they were able to eventually remove the rod. He was able to function. He was able to think. He was a normal human being, except he had one thing. He had no longer any emotions. And because he didn't have any emotions, he wasn't able to make decisions. He didn't, that's the key, is that our emotions will push us to act, and to act quickly. But we don't know which is the right reaction that we have. And that's part of our problem, is that we might have very strong emotions. We call those salient emotions, and they're going to distort the probabilities. So when somebody is talking about fear to somebody, well, that's a salient. And then they start talking about terrorists. And so the odds that a terrorist is going to come, and somebody was telling me last year that when they closed up their cabin up in Minnesota, for God's sake, that this was, they were telling me about their parents who were in their 60s, and Trump was talking about the caravans of people who were coming up, terrorists who were coming up from Central America. When these people locked up their cabin for the winter, they were worried about people coming up from Central America and taking over their cabin, moving into their cabin up in Minnesota. Well, I'll tell you, in the middle of winter, nobody is coming up from anywhere to move into a cabin in middle of Minnesota to begin with. Okay? But, it wasn't rational, but it was that probability of fear, made this to be a very highly, probabilistic outcome. So we laugh at it, but we're not driven by those same fears from people. So Kahneman and Tversky talk about our emotional responses, okay? And they talk about system 1 and 2. Now, these are things that really were thought up back in the 60s. There was initial, I've found research that goes back to the 60s, but Kahneman and Tversky really latched onto this and used it a lot in their writings in the late 80s and 90s, okay? And so they talked about our responses. So S1 is a fast response, okay? It's our survival response. So it's evolved, it's innate, and it's automatic. We don't think. It just happens. My dog sits at the whistle. My dog doesn't think. My dog just knows I sit. I hear a whistle, okay? It's fast, it's intuitive, it's automatic, okay? But S2 allows us to now process, to overcome our bounded rationality, to appraise the situation, okay? So we can think about what's really going on. We can separate out what was incidental from what was integral. So when that clattering and the bang goes on, we can say, that had nothing to do with me stealing the food. I'm going to steal it again, okay? And then we can choose the appropriate response. Whereas oftentimes our responses are totally inappropriate to the situation, but they're the best thing we can think of at the time, okay? So it's a replacement to those simple reactions, okay? And that's where we get these heuristics, okay? So if we want, my daughter used to say, Dad, I can do this and this. She used to claim she could do 2 or 3 things all at the same time. Well, if you are in S1, okay, you're doing things that are totally mindless, sure, you can do that. But if you're in S2, if you're thinking, nope, you can't do it. Our brains get really tired. And so if you're trying to think of doing 2 things where you have to think through them simultaneously, that becomes difficult. And so our brains automatically try to take shortcuts. Back to heuristics. Now I'll skip that. So think about this. Where are you emotionally? Politics. When you get this sort of reaction, tariffs, battles with allies, the whole idea of politics, the caravans of immigrant terrorists, okay? So we're under attack. Everything is always under attack. Now, when you see these things in the market and we see December, November, December, the markets are falling, you get your clients, they get the same thing, okay? Fear, uncertainty, battling against optimism, and they're scared to death. What should I do? And now if the market rebounds back to where it was in November, they're really going to be disturbed. Well, now what the hell do I do? Brian was noting that they had, no, I think it was Corey, that they had a client who they were trying to convince not to get back into the market back last year, later in the year at the highs. And the guy pours his money in because he's upset because he's missing the market move, okay? So, you're running into this, and it's the same sort of emotions that are going on all around you. And moving things a little bit faster because we've really moved through our time, okay? So everything is depending on how we frame our questions, okay? How we frame the issues, how we perceive everything that we do, and how our perceptions occur. And our perceptions are really memory. So we have 3 types of memory. Procedural memory, which is routine. I get into my car in the morning, I start I start my car, then I bother to put on my seatbelt, then I back my car out. And if I'm lucky, I remember to open the garage door. Otherwise, when I hear the clunk, then I stop and open my garage door. Okay, we have a routine. Then we have declarative or rote memory, which is everything you learn in school that you learn to write down, how to do math, how to do time value of money on your calculator, how, what are the important things in EGADIM, all of these issues that you just have to know. And then we have episodic memory. And here's what's cool about episodic is it's personal, it's emotional, and it's usually wrong. Okay, so here's what they found is every time you pull up a memory and revisit it, you edit that memory of what actually happened based on the emotions that you are feeling at the time. Okay, so you rewrite those memories, and the more salient the memory is, the more you're going to revisit it and the more you're going to rewrite it. And that becomes part of the problem. So, I mean, they've done a lot of studies on this. They did the Kennedy study. Where were you when John Kennedy died? When I was coming up. Now they did it with 9/11. And a lot of people right at the time had graduate students write down, where are you and how do you feel? And as they come back and revisit what people write, they find that out 1 year, 63% still have it right of where they were, how they felt. After 3 years, a little more than 50% really can recall things correctly. And after 5 years, under 40% still respond, still have it right, where they were and how they felt at the time. One student said, yes, those were my words, but that's not how I felt, and that's not where I was. It's just sort of, I don't care about the facts. Okay, so we constantly move things into these fields of where we are. Okay, so I've got a few more minutes, probably about 15 minutes left. Are you okay with that? Does anybody have to leave? Okay, thank you all. Okay, so the premise to efficient market hypothesis is that we are unswervingly rational, but our emotions get in the way of that. Okay, so we are filled with regret and fear and sentiment and aversion. We have feelings. We're going to revisit this in a couple weeks. Okay, so we'll come back to this issue. I'll clear it and get my Mr. Mouse. So I'm going to move on to this question. The issue is, can we invest without emotion? And I don't think we can. So let's talk about the 3 heuristics. The first one is representativeness. Okay, what you see is all there is. And what we like to do is take very small data sets and expand them into the world at large. Okay, so this is why we find patterns where there isn't anything. Okay, the last 3 stocks that I bought have gone up in price. Ergo, I'm pretty damn good at what I do. Okay, because, hey, I'm 3 out of 3. The less you know, the better off you are, obviously. So we try to replace reality with our assumptions. That's why we overestimate probability. We're going to replace a hard question with an easy question. The standard is so-and-so, would they make a good president? And what you're asking, what you're responding is, do I agree with his policies? Would he or she as president further my goals? If I answer it that way, then whether that person would make a good president who has to know how to negotiate, how to deal with foreign powers, how to make the country work as a whole, you're not going to answer it that way. You're going to find an easy question. attributes of a person, may infer who they are or where they work. Somebody in a suit might be a lawyer, they might be a business person. They're sure as hell probably not a garbage man. Okay, we're going to infer that. We're going to take what we believe is this random sample, and that it's going to represent a much bigger picture. There's a famous one called the cancer study, the renal study. And what people found, studies found, was that in small counties out in the West, rural counties, the level of renal cancer is much lower than in all counties in general. Okay. What could you infer from that? Anybody? What's the first thing that makes you think?
If renal cancer is lower in rural areas, it must be a healthier place to live.
Yeah, of course. A follow-up study showed that also the incidence of renal cancer is highest in other rural counties in the West that have low populations. What might be happening? I gave the key word.
If it's a low population, if you have one person, it's really going to skew the group.
Yeah, you can easily get distortions. So,
Right.
you know, if you think about it, here's what it looks like from the math. If you're taking a look and every county on its own, you get this very wide distribution. And some counties are going to be out here, rural counties, and others are going to be out here, okay, and have very low incidence. But if you take all the counties as one, it's like the market, then you're going to get this distribution that looks like this. This is what the general population looks like, the incidence of renal cancer, okay? But if you take a look at any one county, you're going to get outliers. So the small numbers are not at all representative of the big picture of what's going on, okay? And it's just like hearing about extreme events alters our perception of what's happening. So random acts become the rule, okay? And that's the problem, is the older you are, the more likely that occurs. I was going to talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem. You don't have to know Bayes' theorem, but I find it to be, I think it's important. Has anybody ever studied it in applied math or anything else? Well, what Bayes' theorem basically says is that when you're calculating odds, you have to always go back to the base rate, okay? And then you have to find the right question. Not the simple answer, but you have to find the right question based on the base rate. And a simple answer is just a simple answer, and it's seldom the right answer. So if we say that it ain't, you know, Dallas Raines claims that he's 90% accurate on his forecasts. So 90% of the time when he forecasts rain, and it does rain, pretty good. But he might only be 80% accurate on dry days. So you get a lot of those dry days when it does rain, okay? And he missed it, okay? So in a SoCal winter, this year we're going to get more, but you know, a lot of winters, we might get 10 days of rain out of 100 days in the winter. So Bayes' rule, Dallas Raines says he's pretty damn good. He's somewhere between 80 and 90% accurate. Bayes' rule says that that forecaster isn't very good. Why? Because he looks at the probability that it's going to rain, and then they take a look at the probability that it ain't going to rain, and then they're taking a look at the probabilities of both. So when we apply the math of what's going on, the probability that it's going to rain is 10%. The probability that it rains and I forecasted rain is 90%, okay? And then I add that to the probability that it isn't going to rain times the probability that it rains and I didn't forecast it was going to rain, and then I divide things, then I find that under Bayes' theorem, his odds of being right were only 33%. You know, basically you could work out the math, but you find that a coin would do better. It's all based on the base rate. Here's what's really always comes out in the movies. You know, there's a one-time encounter. The woman takes a pregnancy test and it shows up that it's a positive. Is she pregnant? Under Bayes' theorem, you can say, well, it becomes a function of the base rate. What's the probability of pregnancy after unprotected sex? It's 15%. I did look that up. And so the probability of no pregnancy after totally unprotected sex is 85%. And then we have, you know, the tests are positive 90% of the time. And maybe with this one, you get 15% of the time you get a false positive. So if we go through the math again of Bayes' theorem, which is predicated on this fact that the probability of pregnancy after unprotected sex is fairly low, we find that even with a positive test, the odds are 50-50. Don't get the shotgun. So that's representativeness. Or, I mean, that's not representativeness. That is the law of small numbers. It is representativeness. Okay? So now here comes something called the conjunctive fallacy. Okay? You're going to have to think back when you were in 8th grade. This is real fast. Just give me your answer right away. Linda's 31, single, outspoken, and bright. She majored in philosophy. She's concerned about discrimination and social justice. She has been active in the Time's Up movement. What is Linda? Do you think she's a teacher? Okay. Teacher is 1. Does she work in a bookstore, do yoga? 2. Is she an active feminist? 3. Does she work in the financial industry? 4. Is she a teacher and an active feminist? 5. What is your guess? All right. I'm getting a lot of 5s. 4, 4, 5. Okay. So, Zakia, you've been fairly quiet. Why did you say 5?
Well, I don't know too many people, for one, who are teachers and didn't major in philosophy or something similar to that. And then also, most active feminists are concerned about discrimination and social justice. So
Okay. All right. So you got a good excuse. Erica, why did you say teacher?
Because I didn't wait long enough to see the the last choice.
All right. Okay, let's go back to 8th grade when you all learned about Venn diagrams. Okay, so here's this data set right here. Okay, it's a pretty big data set, and this is teachers. Okay, and then we have another data set, kind of smaller, feminists. Okay, not all feminists are teachers. Not all teachers are feminists. There is some conjunction here where you have teachers who are also feminists. Okay? So what is more likely? That Linda is there in that data set, or that she's somewhere in the much bigger data set of being a teacher?
Greater likelihood that she's a teacher.
That's my point. Okay. So that's the whole key, is you have to think about what are, is it really representative of everything you think about? The next is availability. When we're thinking about things, this is our recall. We tend to think about things that, again, like I said, they are salient. But remember what I said about recall. The problem of recall is it's typically wrong. Despite the facts, we trust our memories, what we think happened. And the more salient, the more dramatic or vivid the easier it is for us to make this recollection of something that may or may not have happened. So things become dominated by outliers. So of course, we always say that you have a far greater chance of dying by lightning than you are by sharks or tornadoes. Okay? But you're never going to see, everybody likes to watch Sharknado. Nobody cares about lightning. It's the same thing, the perceived danger of, it used to be airline travel. Now it's driverless cars. Driverless cars are still a hell of a lot safer than driven cars with people in it. But look at what happened in Arizona, right, Lucas?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. There you had people in a town in Prescott, Arizona, who were attacking driverless cars because they're scared to death of them. Because they remembered an accident. Terrorism, since that's become the theme of the government shutdown, it's the same sort of thing. It's a major threat to the West. Or is it? You hear so much about it, and it becomes the sort of thing that drives our memories. So, over the last 40 years, has terrorism become a bigger problem? Let's think about it in Europe, because we hear about it even more so in Europe, but then we can talk about it in the US. Excuse me. Okay. Is it worse or better than it was 40 years ago? Has it become a worse issue? How many think it's become more of an issue? Raise your hand. Anybody know? Maybe only. How many think it isn't as much of an issue? Okay, so Eric says less of an issue. Okay, Brian says less of an issue. All right. Well, you guys are much better than most people, because I like to show. Everybody says, normally my class says, well, it is an issue. It's a frightening issue. Here's a picture in Europe. And this is the number of incidents in the gray and the number of deaths down here. Okay. And this is what I lived through in the 70s, and friends of mine who grew up in the UK in the 70s lived through. We had a little thing going on called the IRA. Okay. And so when you would come out of the pub at night, you learned to look under your car for a bomb. Okay. So here we have the outlier of something that occurred, the Lockerbie flight, but you can see the trend of deaths that have gone on in Europe since. Okay. So the number of incidents, this was Madrid. So this one was caused by Spaniards, in fact, Basque separatists. This one in Oslo was caused by a crazy guy who is a Norwegian. So we have very few incidents that are really being caused by external terrorists, but we're told that it's external terrorism that is occurring all of the time. I'm going to skip it because, that's what we hear. It's the same thing with our forests. Our forests are burning. California's disappearing. And here was a picture that I saw that showed the number of acres that have burned in the total U.S. wildland. And you can see what has happened. We went through this Smokey Bear era of fire suppression. And so relative to what our thinking is from the 80s, yeah, the number of acres burned have gone up. But relative to what was normal, it's still a fraction, even though it's so salient, especially to people out here when you're thinking about it. The last area is anchoring. Okay, so again, we hate ambiguity. We don't like to make decisions if we don't have something that we can hang on to. We need a reference point. So this is why whenever you get Christmas time, you see sale prices. Everything is tied to 40% off of regular price. Well, that regular price was just the price that they made up the day before the sale price went on, of course. It's the same thing for technical analysts. They want to create price supports, resistance level. They need to anchor to that. We even find the same thing for traders. Both individuals, when I buy a stock, I don't want to sell it. Even if the stock is going down, I'm going to anchor the value of that stock to the price that I bought it at. Okay? And that's going to tell me if there's a profit, then it's a good deal. And a loss, is always against that anchor price. And that's the fair value as far as I'm concerned. Okay? When I'm anchoring. If fair value is just whatever the stock is priced at, now I'm going to throw that out as soon as I own the stock. When I don't own the stock, I'm going to agree that the fair value is whatever it's priced at until I bought it. It's the same thing that with roulette wheels. Say you've got a string of 8 reds in a row. What are the odds that the color is going to be brown? Is going to be black? Or is it white? What are the odds? 50-50, of course. It's like coin flips. If you've had 8 heads in a row, people are going to be betting like crazy. It's going to be a tail. It's 50-50. Okay? So we anchor to our everything. Okay? So that's kind of this whole idea of heuristics and emotions and how they tie together. And so from those emotions and heuristics, hopefully you've got a little bit better idea of how our clients act and believe. And we can use that as kind of a springboard to then move on to our biases. So let's go through the round table tonight. I'll use this. Okay, and we're going to start with somebody different. So I'm going to start with Jill. You've been very quiet tonight.
Hi. So
you have a voice.
I do have a voice. I wanted to bring up a couple points for tonight's roundtable. So it was pretty interesting, the conversation that was had around how to address a client who's invested in the S&P and with the market going through a downturn. And I know you used an example of someone driving recklessly on PCH, the one causing you to swerve, and all of those emotions just become instant. So I kind of wanted to share my previous experience as an HR director, because I had to deal with a lot of employee relations, and majority of the time, I have employees that come in who are angry, hurt, embarrassed, and majority of the time, they just want to feel heard. They want to feel like their emotions are being acknowledged. So one thing that I've learned was practicing empathy. And I think that's something that most successful financial planners recognize, because you're going to be dealing with clients who are going to be going through life changes, major life changes, divorce, health issues, perhaps passing of a loved one. So although we cannot control the market, what we can do as financial planners or advisors is do our best to help our client control their emotions using empathy, and then using our knowledge and logic to help them see the big picture and maybe recognize some positives. So I kind of wanted to just throw that out there. And then I think another aspect of tonight's class was that I enjoyed was your perspective on like the terrorists in the forests and just helping us see the big picture. So those were the two that I found value in tonight.
Okay, good. And that's why I think it's so important that we work on, levels of financial literacy. The more people are knowledgeable, this is one of the keys to risk tolerance, is the more you do really understand something, the risk and return, the more risk tolerant you become. It's that going back to that sense of having this feeling of control, or at least an appreciation and an understanding of what's going on. Gives you an awful lot of at least confidence to be able to stay the course. So I think you're spot on with that. Brian.
Yeah, so I think a lot of good content. Some of it's a little heavy. I'm probably going to have to review some of it again, but especially the math part and the base.
You don't have to memorize it, but it's good to know.
Yeah, we're getting close to 10:30 over here on the East Coast, so my brain's not as sharp. But in the middle of your class, you started talking about buying a car and bonus. So interestingly enough, I spent an hour this morning while we were getting ready, my wife and I, talking about the new car we were going to buy because her lease is up in February. And I have this exhaustive brainstorm about, Lexus and Toyota being the best buy, they'll go the longest miles. How long are we going to keep the car? And she goes, I just want a car that makes me feel good. And so she starts listing off all these cars that I hate that have Apple CarPlay, because that's one of her must-haves. As I'm going through this whole process, it's making me cognizant of the fact that, while I'm being logical and trying to find some kind of spreadsheet formula in my mind, she's just trying to make a decision about a car based on how it's going to make her feel. And we're going to have to reconcile that at some point, but yeah.
Yeah, my daughter went through the same sort of process. I drive a 5-year-old Subaru Outback, and I'm happy as a clam. She had, she broke up with a long-term boyfriend. She had 2 of her best friends have moved out of the area, and you're living in Thousand Oaks. You end up, oftentimes you're single. You can't really move out. Everything was crappy. So she bought a BMW. And I'm out of the country at the time, and my wife tells me, and I'm going, what? What is it? This is against all the values, all the things, that I think I've ever taught her, et cetera, et cetera. It made her happy. It replaced, all this stuff. She could afford it, but it replaced, all of this stuff that has been happening in her life. And so she did something that makes her happy. And it's illogical, irrational to me, but not to her. Not my call. Lucas.
Yeah, I think something that I found interesting so far this week that we talked about tonight, and then has also come up a little bit in the books, has been like the system 1, system 2, of how there's a lot of things where you will just automatically almost react or initially have a response to, and then there's that follow-up reaction in your system 2 thinking where it's informed by your system 1, how you're first seeing it and how you're first reacting to it, but you really have to stop and focus on it and spend energy where you can't be doing 2 of those things at the same time. Like you can multitask if you're walking and talking to somebody, but once you have to actually get into something that involves more of your thought process, it's really hard to manage both of those, like you were saying, without your brain just getting tired and one of them starting to slip.
Yep. Yeah. It's really, it's so hard to get people to realize that, but it's a fact. Erica.
Hello. So one of the things that struck me in the reading this week was the discussion of the 2 dogs, and I don't even remember which book this was in. It was 2 dogs in kennels, and they were they electrified the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the one with the dog in the kennel that could push the button and make it stop had a much better. He was able to handle the situation a lot better than the dog who had no control over it, just became despondent.
Yeah.
And that was just so interesting to me. I, extrapolated that out in such a big way. Just the idea of feeling like you have some sort of control. So that, being all philosophical for a second, but that made me think about when I was raising money for medical research, and so much of those gifts were just purely driven on they have no other control over what's happening, but people would give money towards the research because that was some way of them to try to fight.
Exactly. And that's a kind of, and I think that becomes one of those fascinating areas on the area of charitable giving. What is it that people choose? Why do they choose the amounts that they choose? And how much of it is triggered by irrational thoughts, or non-economic thoughts? Yet it becomes very important to them.
Right. A lot of people give way over give what would match their I worked for a university, and there were a lot of people you would see from teachers and preachers give such a greater proportion of their wealth in something they really believed in.
Yeah. That's why I think that reading some of Mary Statman's work might give you some good insights into that area. Zakia.
Hi. So I
Hello.
guess so I guess for me the most interesting thing we talked about tonight was the guy with the metal rod through his head.
Phineas Gage.
Yes. So I guess it's kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that you can't make decisions without emotions, because essentially everything we do is a decision. So I guess I'm getting thinking and decision making slightly entangled, if you know
Okay.
what I'm saying.
What you're doing is your normal routine. What you do every day, all the stuff that you do, a lot of that is based just on heuristics. It's
Yeah.
automatic. You have a routine. It's when you have to stop and start to think about, when you move to S2, and you have to say, well, I could do this or I could do that.
Okay.
So when you're making choices, or when you run into a condition of uncertainty that you have to stop and think about it, and that's when you need that emotion to help you figure out. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. And Eric.
I think he said he had to sign off.
Oh, no. All right, we lost him at the last minute. Okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I know this one went a few minutes long tonight. Sometimes that happens. We kind of get carried away because the topics, I love this stuff. It's just so fascinating. So thank you for sticking around. And I'm going to be looking for, I've got 2 people who've already given me what area they want to talk about, and they're going to start refining down. So think about what area you want to start to do your research in, and come to me, and I'm happy to give you feedback, okay? So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Good night.